When two corrupt cops targeted an elderly black man for a routine civil asset seizure, they thought they'd found an easy mark, until they discovered their victim was the father of the one man in the city with the power to end their careers. Walter Jenkins is a 75-year-old retired postal worker who has lived in the same modest home in Oakwood Heights for over 4 decades. The neighborhood has changed over the years, but Walter's routine hasn't. Every month, he withdraws his pension in cash, preferring the security of knowing exactly what he has rather than trusting a bank card. Today is no different as Walter carefully tucks an envelope containing $800 into his jacket pocket after leaving the bank. He walks with a slight limp from his years of delivering mail, but carries himself with dignity and purpose. The afternoon sun casts long shadows as he decides to take a shortcut through Riverside Park to get home before dark. Unbeknownst to Walter, Officers Daly and Mercer are parked in an unmarked vehicle near the park entrance. Both are relatively new transfers to the precinct with reputations for aggressive policing tactics. They'd been targeting this area after reports of drug deals, though their methods have already raised concerns among some of their colleagues. "Look at this guy," Daly says, nodding toward Walter. "Looks nervous. Coming from the direction of the high school. Could be our dealer." Mercer looks doubtful. "He's just an old man." "Perfect cover," Daly insists, already opening his door. "Let's check him out." Walter sees the two men approaching, but thinks nothing of it until they flash badges and identify themselves as police officers. His initial reaction is polite confusion. "Good afternoon, officers. Is something wrong?" Walter asks, his voice steady but his heart beginning to race. He's lived through decades of being approached by police for no reason, and despite his age, the anxiety never fully disappears. "We've had reports of drug activity in this area," Officer Daly says, circling Walter like a predator. "Mind telling us where you're coming from and where you're headed?" Walter explains that he's just been to the bank and is heading home. When prompted, he reluctantly shows his identification, which clearly indicates he lives just 3 blocks away. "Mind if we search you?" Mercer asks, though his tone suggests it's not really a question. "I do mind," Walter replies firmly. "I haven't done anything wrong." This response seems to trigger something in Daly, who steps closer. "Listen, we can do this the easy way or the hard way. Public safety concerns give us probable cause." Walter knows his rights, but he also knows the reality of his situation. With great reluctance, he allows them to search him. When they find the envelope of cash, everything changes. "What's this?" Daly asks, holding up the envelope with mock suspicion. "That's a lot of cash for an afternoon stroll." "That's my pension money," Walter explains, his voice rising slightly. "I just withdrew it from the bank. I can show you the receipt." The officers exchange glances, and something unspoken passes between them. Daly pockets the envelope. "We're going to have to confiscate this as evidence," he announces. Walter's face darkens with anger and disbelief. "Evidence of what?" "That's my money. You have no right." "Civil asset forfeiture," Mercer explains with rehearsed authority. "The cash is suspected of being connected to illegal activity. You can file a claim with the department to try to get it back if you can prove it's legitimate." Walter feels a tightness in his chest that has nothing to do with his age. "This is robbery," he says quietly. "I want your badge numbers and your supervisor's name." Daly laughs. "Sure thing, old-timer. File all the complaints you want." They provide the information with smug confidence, clearly believing that nothing will come of this elderly man's protests. They leave Walter standing alone in the park, without his money, and with only a hastily scribbled receipt acknowledging the seizure of his property. "Good luck with that paperwork," Daly calls back as they walk away. Systems backed up for months. Walter Jenkins stands alone in Riverside Park, the afternoon sun slanting through the trees as his world seems to collapse around him. The two officers, Daly and Mercer, are already distant figures now, swaggering away with his $800 pension money tucked safely in Daly's pocket. Walter's hand trembles as he unfolds the hastily scrawled receipt they'd handed him with obvious disdain. The handwriting is nearly illegible, a deliberate act Walter recognizes from decades of navigating systems designed to frustrate people like him into giving up. The document merely states that $800 was seized as suspected proceeds of illegal activity, with a case number and the precinct address printed at the bottom. A deep, familiar heaviness settles in Walter's chest. It's a feeling he knows too well. The impotent rage and humiliation that comes from having his dignity stripped away in broad daylight by people wearing badges. At 75 years old, Walter Jenkins has lived through the civil rights movement, watched as laws changed on paper while practices change much more slowly on the streets. He's taught himself and his children how to navigate a world that often sees black men as threats first and citizens second. But the indignity never gets easier to bear. An elderly white woman walking her dog gives Walter a wide berth on the path, clutching her purse a little tighter as she passes. This small gesture, one he's seen thousands of times over his lifetime, suddenly feels like salt in an open wound. Walter straightens his shoulders with deliberate effort. He won't let them see him diminished. Not ever. Walter makes his way to a park bench beneath a sprawling oak tree and lowers himself down, his arthritic hip protesting the movement. His thoughts race to practical concerns. That money was meant for his mortgage payment, the electric bill, his wife Evelyn's heart medication. Without it, they'll have to dip into their small emergency fund, carefully cultivated over decades of frugal living. The injustice burns, but the immediate financial worry threatens to overwhelm him. After a moment of collecting himself, Walter reaches into his pocket and pulls out his old flip phone, a source of endless teasing from his grandchildren, who can't understand why anyone would choose such an ancient device over a smartphone. But Walter has always valued reliability over flash, and this phone has served him faithfully for years. His fingers move automatically to the third speed dial button, his son. As the phone rings, Walter rehearses what he'll say. He doesn't want to sound like a helpless old man, doesn't want his son to hear the tremor of outrage and shame in his voice. Marcus has worked so hard to get where he is, and Walter has always been careful not to burden him with 1,000 small indignities that define an elderly black man's existence in America. But this is different. This is theft, pure and simple, conducted under the pretense of the law. The ringing stops, and Walter hears his son's secretary's professional voice. Chief Jenkins' office. "Hello, Sandra," Walter says, forcing warmth into his voice. "It's Walter Jenkins. Is my son available?" "Mr. Jenkins, of course. The chief is just wrapping up a meeting. Let me put you through right away." Walter hears the click and transfer of the line. In the background, he can make out the familiar sounds of the police station. Telephones ringing, indistinct conversations, the occasional burst of radio chatter. These sounds once represented security and order to Walter. Now they feel like something else entirely. "Dad?" Marcus's voice comes through, instantly alert with concern. "Everything okay?" Marcus Jenkins sits in his spacious office at the heart of the police headquarters, surrounded by the trappings of his success. Framed commendations, his police academy graduation photo, a picture of him shaking hands with the mayor. At 45, he's the youngest police chief in the city's history and the first black man to hold the position. His rapid rise through the ranks has been a source of immense pride for Walter and Evelyn, who sacrificed everything to ensure their children had opportunities they never did. "Son," Walter begins, finding his voice suddenly thick with emotion. He clears his throat. "I've just had an encounter with some of your officers." Something in Walter's tone causes Marcus to straighten in his chair, his full attention engaged. He's been a cop for over 20 years, and he knows the cadence of someone working hard to maintain composure. "What kind of encounter?" Marcus asks, already reaching for a pen and notepad. Walter recounts the events methodically, the way Marcus taught him to report incidents. Details first, emotions later. He describes the officer's approach, their immediate suspicion despite his identification showing he lived just blocks away, the search conducted despite his protest, and finally, the seizure of his pension money under the guise of civil asset forfeiture. $800. Marcus. They took it all. Said I could file a claim if I wanted it back. Like they knew damn well most people can't navigate that process or wait months for a resolution. Walter's voice finally cracks with indignation. One of them, Daly, I think, he laughed about it. Said good luck with that paperwork. Systems backed up for months. Marcus's pen stills on the paper. His face, normally carefully controlled in his professional environment, darkens with a mixture of personal outrage and professional concern. He's been monitoring several transferred officers with problematic records from other precincts, and Daly and Mercer have already appeared on his radar for their aggressive policing tactics. Did they identify themselves properly? Badge numbers? Marcus asks, his tone now coolly professional. They did, after I insisted, Walter confirms, pulling the receipt from his pocket again. Badge numbers 8457 and 8912. They gave me this receipt, but it's barely legible. They clearly didn't expect me to actually follow up. Marcus writes down the numbers, though he already knows exactly who they are. Can you describe them, Dad? Walter does so with the precision of someone who has spent a lifetime making careful observations about police officers as a matter of survival. Daly, white, around 30, short brown hair with a military cut, stocky build, about 5'10". Small scar above his right eyebrow. Mercer, also white, taller and thinner, probably 6'2". Light brown hair longer on top, narrow face with a prominent nose, speaks with a slight southern accent. As Walter speaks, Marcus can picture them perfectly. Daly and Mercer had transferred in just 3 months ago from a precinct in the southern part of the state. Their previous captain had given them glowing recommendations, but Marcus had been suspicious. Their personnel files contained several civilian complaints that had been dismissed without proper investigation. He placed them under informal observation, assigning them to work with some of his most by-the-book officers, but clearly that hadn't been enough. Dad, listen to me, Marcus says, his voice lowering even though his office door is closed. This isn't right, and it isn't going to stand. I want you to come down to the station right now. I'll send a patrol car to pick you up. Walter hesitates. Son, I don't want special treatment because I'm your father. This isn't special treatment, Marcus responds firmly. This is the treatment every citizen deserves when their rights are violated. I'd do the same for anyone who walked in with a legitimate complaint. He pauses, then adds, besides, I need a formal statement from you, and I need to see that receipt. Walter considers this. Throughout his son's career, he's been careful never to ask for favors or special consideration. He raised Marcus to believe in fairness and equal application of the law, values Marcus has carried into his leadership of the department. But his son is right. This isn't about family. It's about justice. All right, Walter agrees. I'm at Riverside Park, near the eastern entrance. I'll have Officer Washington there in 5 minutes. She's one of our best. Marcus's voice softens slightly. Dad, I'm sorry this happened to you. Not your fault, son, Walter says automatically. Maybe not directly, but it happened in my precinct, under my command, Marcus replies, his voice hardening again. And I promise you, it's going to be addressed. As Walter waits for his ride, he reflects on his son's journey. Marcus had joined the police force against Walter's initial wishes. Walter, like many black parents of his generation, had feared for his son's safety both on the streets and within a system historically hostile to black officers. But Marcus had been determined to create change from within, to be part of transforming how policing worked in their community. Someone has to be the first. Marcus had told him during their heated argument 25 years ago. Someone has to walk through the door so others can follow. Now, Marcus was the chief, with the power to shape policy, training, and accountability measures. Walter feels a complex mixture of emotions, pride in his son's achievement, anger at the situation, and a quiet hope that perhaps this incident might lead to meaningful change for others beyond himself. Officer Washington arrives promptly in a marked patrol car. She's a young black woman with a professional demeanor who treats Walter with pronounced respect, addressing him as Mr. Jenkins and offering him assistance into the vehicle. As they drive toward the station, Walter notices how she radios in their movement according to protocol, but doesn't mention who she's transporting. Marcus is doing, no doubt, giving the officers who robbed him no warning about what's coming. Walter sits up straighter in the passenger seat, a determination settling over him. His son had chosen to fight for justice by wearing the badge. Now, Walter would do his part by holding those who dishonor that badge accountable. Those officers had picked the wrong elderly black man to victimize today, not because his son was the chief, but because Walter Jenkins had spent a lifetime standing up for what's right, and he wasn't about to stop now. As the police station comes into view, Walter Jenkins prepares himself for what's to come. This wasn't just about his $800 anymore. This was about every person who had ever been bullied, robbed, and dismissed by those sworn to protect them. His son had opened doors in this department. Walter would make sure they stayed open for justice to walk through. The Jackson Heights Police Department headquarters stands as an imposing structure of red brick and granite, built in the 1950s with an architectural style that was meant to convey authority and permanence. Walter Jenkins has driven past this building thousands of times over the decades, but he's rarely had reason to enter. As Officer Washington escorts him through the glass front doors, Walter is struck by the bustling energy of the place. Officers moving with purpose, the constant chirp of radios, civilian staff navigating between desks with stacks of paperwork, the controlled chaos of law enforcement at work. Officer Washington guides Walter through the security checkpoint with notable efficiency. The uniformed officer manning the metal detector gives Walter a respectful nod as they pass, something Walter registers with mild surprise. "Afternoon, Mr. Jenkins," the officer says, and Walter returns the greeting with a small nod, wondering how this young man knows his name. Officer Washington doesn't explain as she leads him through the maze of hallways toward the central bullpen where detectives and patrol officers complete their paperwork and process arrests. The bullpen is a large open space filled with desks arranged in clusters, most occupied by officers typing reports or talking on phones. Computer screens cast a blue glow on faces focused on their work. The normality of the scene strikes Walter. These are just people doing their jobs. Some of them probably decent, some of them probably not, all of them wielding extraordinary power over ordinary citizens' lives. Somewhere in this room, he thinks, are other receipts like the one folded in his pocket, other seizures documented with the same careless scrawl, other lives disrupted by the casual exercise of authority. Walter spots them immediately. Officers Daly and Mercer sit at adjacent desks near the center of the room, their postures relaxed as they process paperwork. Daly leans back in his chair, laughing at something Mercer has said. The sight of them so at ease, so untroubled by what they've done, sends a fresh surge of anger through Walter's chest. Officer Washington notices his gaze hardening and places a gentle hand on his elbow, guiding him to a chair near the entrance to the bullpen. "Chief Jenkins asked that you wait here, sir," she says quietly. "He'll be out momentarily." Walter sits, his back straight, his eyes never leaving the two officers who took his money. He watches as they joke with each other, completely unaware of what's coming. Mercer opens a drawer and pulls out a candy bar, breaking it in half to share with his partner. The casual camaraderie of men who believe themselves untouchable. Gradually, Walter becomes aware of a subtle shift in the room's atmosphere. Officers passing by glance at him with expressions ranging from curiosity to respect. Some nod in his direction or offer a quiet "Mr. Jenkins." Others whisper to colleagues after noticing him. Walter realizes that many of these officers must know exactly who he is, the father of their chief. A few older officers approach to shake his hand, mentioning interactions from years past, when Marcus was rising through the ranks, and Walter would attend department functions to support his son. "Your boy's done good, Mr. Jenkins," an older white surgeon tells him, his handshake firm and sincere. Best chief this department's seen in my 30 years here. Walter accepts these interactions with dignified nods, but his attention remains focused on Daly and Mercer, who remain oblivious to his presence. He watches as Daly pulls out his envelope, and removes the cash to count it again, smirking as he does so. The sight of his pension money being handled so casually, so disrespectfully, makes Walter's jaw clench. He breathes deeply, reminding himself that justice comes in many forms. Sometimes it's swift and dramatic. Other times it's methodical and by the book. He trusts his son to know which kind is needed here. A door at the far end of the bullpen opens, and Chief Marcus Jenkins emerges from his office. At 6'2", Marcus cuts an impressive figure in his crisp blue uniform adorned with the gold insignia of his rank. His presence immediately commands attention, a quality Walter has always admired in his son. Marcus has the same deep-set eyes as Walter, the same strong jawline, though his closely cropped hair shows no signs of the gray that has overtaken Walter's. Despite the 24 years that separate them, the family resemblance is unmistakable. Marcus moves with deliberate steps into the bullpen, his expression neutral but radiating authority. Several officers notice him and straighten instinctively. Marcus nods at them, but continues walking until he reaches the center of the room. He stands there silently for a moment, and the busy hum of activity gradually quiets as people become aware of their chief's presence. Within 30 seconds, the room has fallen into an expectant hush. Only then do officers Daly and Mercer look up from their paperwork, noticing the unusual silence. Their expressions shift from casual disinterest to alert professionalism as they spot the chief. Daly hurriedly tucks the envelope of cash into a desk drawer, a motion that doesn't escape Marcus's notice. Officers Daly and Mercer, Marcus says, his voice carrying across the now silent room. I understand you conducted a search and seizure operation in Riverside Park approximately 1 hour ago. Is that correct? They stand at attention, confusion briefly flickering across their faces before pride takes its place. They clearly believe they're about to be commended. Yes, sir, Daly responds, a hint of smugness in his tone. Suspected drug money. All by the book. I see, Marcus says, his voice dangerously calm. And this is the civilian in question. He gestures toward Walter, who rises to his feet with deliberate dignity. All eyes in the room turn to the elderly man, and then back to the two officers, whose expressions transform as comprehension dawns. The color drains from both their faces as they make the connection, recognition and fear replacing their previous confidence. This is Walter Jenkins. Marcus continues, the formal introduction rendered heavy with significance by his measured tone. 40-year resident of this community, retired postal worker with an impeccable record, and my father. The silence in the room deepens, charged now with collective shock and anticipation. A few officers exchange glances, while others stare straight ahead, not wanting to miss what comes next. Walter stands perfectly still, his gaze locked on the two men who robbed him, his expression revealing nothing but dignified patience. Officer Mercer swallows visibly, his Adam's apple bobbing in his thin neck. Chief, we didn't. We had no way of knowing. Marcus raises a hand, silencing him mid-sentence. That's precisely the point, Officer Mercer. You had no way of knowing who this man was related to, so you felt free to treat him with disrespect and deprive him of his property without due process. His voice remains even, but carries an edge of steel that makes several officers in the room straighten their posture reflexively. Sir, Daly attempts, his previous arrogance evaporated. We had reasonable suspicion. Did you? Marcus interrupts, his eyebrow raising slightly. Please elaborate on the specific articulable facts that led you to believe my father was involved in criminal activity. Daly hesitates, clearly searching for a justification that won't sound as hollow as it is. He seemed nervous, sir, coming from an area known for drug transactions, and he was carrying a large sum of cash. Marcus nods thoughtfully, as if considering this explanation. I see. "And did you inquire about the source of this cash?" "He said it was his pension money, sir," Mercer admits reluctantly. "And did you ask for proof of this claim?" "He mentioned a receipt, but you didn't bother to verify his story," Marcus finishes for him. "Because it was easier to assume the worst about an elderly black man walking through a public park in broad daylight." "Is that an accurate summary, Officer Mercer?" The question hangs in the air, unanswerable. Several officers shift uncomfortably in their seats, perhaps recognizing similar shortcuts they've taken in their own work. Walter remains motionless, his presence a silent testament to every person who has ever stood powerless before a badge. Marcus turns slightly, addressing the entire room now. "Let me be very clear. What happened today was not police work. It was harassment and theft conducted under color of authority." His voice remains controlled, but there's an unmistakable intensity building beneath his professional demeanor. Civil asset forfeiture is a tool meant to disrupt criminal enterprises, not to victimize innocent citizens. It is particularly not to be used as a method to intimidate or steal from elderly black men walking home from the bank. He turns back to face Daly and Mercer directly. "Officer Daly, please retrieve the envelope you placed in your drawer." Daly hesitates only briefly before opening the drawer and removing Walter's envelope. His hand trembles slightly as he holds it out. "Count it," Marcus orders, out loud, "so everyone can hear exactly how much you took from this citizen without cause." Daly's face flushes with embarrassment as he opens the envelope and begins counting the bills one by one. 100, 200, 300. His voice grows quieter with each stack until Marcus instructs him to speak up. When he finishes, $800. "Sir," the total hangs in the air, a damning testament to what was nearly stolen. "Now," Marcus says, "I want you to walk over to Mr. Jenkins, return his property, and apologize for violating his constitutional rights." The walk across the bullpen feels endless to everyone watching. Daly's steps are stiff, his expression frozen somewhere between defiance and shame. When he reaches Walter, he extends the envelope without meeting the older man's eyes. "I apologize for the misunderstanding, sir," he mutters, the words clearly difficult for him. Walter takes the envelope with steady hands, tucking it carefully into his inside jacket pocket. He regards Daly with calm dignity, neither accepting nor rejecting the insufficient apology. His silence speaks volumes, leaving Daly standing awkwardly before him. "Is that how you were trained to apologize for a professional failure, Officer Daly?" Marcus asks from across the room, his voice cutting through the tension. Daly straightens, finally looking Walter in the eye. "I apologize for violating your rights, Mr. Jenkins," he says, his voice clearer now. "It was unprofessional and wrong." Walter nods once, accepting this more genuine expression of regret. "I accept your apology, officer," he says, his deep voice resonant with a lifetime of dignity maintained in the face of indignity. "I hope you learn from this." Marcus allows this moment to settle before he speaks again. "Officer Daly, Officer Mercer, my office now. The rest of you, remember what you saw today. This is not who we are. This is not what we do, not in my precinct." As the two officers follow Marcus toward his office, the room remains silent. Walter watches them go, feeling no triumph, only a somber satisfaction that accountability has been served. An older detective approaches him, offering to show him to a comfortable waiting area until his son is finished. As Walter follows her, he notices the expressions on the faces of the officers he passes, some ashamed, some thoughtful, some nodding with approval. Walter knows this incident alone won't transform the department or heal the deep wounds between police and the communities they serve. But as he takes a seat in the quiet waiting area, he allows himself to hope that what happened today might be a step, however small, toward the justice his son has dedicated his career to building. Sometimes change comes not through grand gestures, but through moments of personal reckoning when systems of power are forced to see their impact on individual lives. Today, at least, the system had seen him. The heavy oak door to Chief Jenkins' office closes with a decisive click that seems to reverberate through the entire precinct. Inside, the spacious office falls into a charged silence. Marcus moves behind his large mahogany desk but doesn't sit, choosing instead to remain standing as he faces Officers Daly and Mercer, who stand at rigid attention before him. The afternoon sunlight slants through Venetian blinds, casting striped shadows across the room, giving the scene an almost cinematic quality. On the wall behind Marcus hangs his framed oath of office, the words "to protect and serve" prominently visible. Beside it are photographs charting his rise through the ranks. Marcus at the academy graduation, Marcus receiving his detective's shield, Marcus being sworn in as chief. Each image represents a milestone in a career built on integrity and reform. The irony isn't lost on Daly and Mercer as they face the man whose life's work they've just undermined with a single act of misconduct. "Sit down," Marcus finally says, his voice controlled but cold with professional disappointment. The officers comply immediately, sinking into the chairs across from him. Marcus remains standing for another long moment before finally taking his seat, the power dynamic in the room unmistakable. "I want to be absolutely clear about something," Marcus begins, leaning forward slightly, his hands clasped on the desk. "What happened today has nothing to do with the fact that Walter Jenkins is my father. What happened today could have, and very likely has, happened to countless citizens who don't have the chief of police as a relative. The only difference is that most of those citizens never see justice." He lets those words settle between them. Neither officer meets his gaze directly. "The internal affairs investigation I'm about to initiate isn't because you targeted my father. It's because you violated department policy, constitutional protections, and the public trust. It's because you performed an unjustified search and attempted to steal a citizen's money through the abuse of civil asset forfeiture laws. I would take exactly the same actions if the citizen in question were a complete stranger." Officer Mercer shifts uncomfortably in his seat. "Chief, we were just following established procedures for—" "Do not," Marcus interrupts, his voice suddenly sharp, "insult this department by suggesting what you did today follows our established procedures. I personally reviewed and revised our civil forfeiture guidelines when I took this position 3 years ago. I know exactly what those procedures are, and you followed none of them." He opens a drawer and pulls out a thick policy manual, flipping it open to a tabbed section. Section 4.3 of Departmental Policy. Officers shall not initiate asset seizure without documented reasonable suspicion that the assets in question are directly connected to specific criminal activity. What specific criminal activity did you document in connection with my father's pension money? Officer Daly. Daly shifts in his seat. "We hadn't documented it yet, sir. We were going to." "So you conducted the seizure first and planned to justify it later." Marcus interrupts again. "That's not procedure. That's misconduct." He flips to another section. Section 4.5. Officers must provide detailed receipts including specific reasons for seizure, expected timeline for resolution, and complete information on the appeals process. "Let's see the receipt you provided to Mr. Jenkins." Mercer reluctantly produces his copy of the hastily scrawled receipt. Marcus examines it briefly before placing it on the desk between them, his expression hardening further. "This is unacceptable. No court would uphold a seizure documented like this, and you know it, which suggests you never expected this seizure to be challenged." Marcus's gaze is piercing now. "How many others, officers, how many other citizens have you treated this way, counting on their inability or unwillingness to navigate the bureaucracy required to get their property back?" The question hangs in the air, met with telling silence. Marcus picks up his phone and presses a button. "Send in Lieutenant Rivera, please." Within moments, a sharp knock on the door announces the arrival of Lieutenant Maria Rivera, head of Internal Affairs. She enters with a professional nod to Marcus and takes a position standing to the side of his desk, her expression neutral but her eyes assessing the two officers with clinical precision. Lieutenant Rivera will be handling the investigation into today's incident and reviewing all of your previous seizures from the past 6 months, Marcus informs them. You are both suspended without pay effective immediately, pending the results of that investigation. Daly's face flushes with anger and alarm. Chief, you can't. I can, and I am, Marcus states flatly. Your badges and service weapons, please. For a moment, it seems Daly might protest further, but a warning look from Mercer silences him. With stiff movements, both officers remove their badges and guns, placing them on the desk between them. The heavy sound of metal on wood punctuates the severity of the moment. This isn't just about money, though I suspect Lieutenant Rivera will find numerous questionable seizures in your record. Marcus continues, his voice measured but unyielding. This is about how you exercise the extraordinary power entrusted to you by the public. You stopped a citizen without reasonable suspicion. You searched him without probable cause. You seized his property without due process. And you did it all with an attitude that suggested you expected to get away with it. Marcus stands now, signaling that the meeting is drawing to a close. Lieutenant Rivera will escort you to process your suspension paperwork. You'll be contacted with updates on the investigation. If the findings warrant criminal charges, the district attorney will be brought in. Criminal charges? Mercer exclaims, speaking up more forcefully now. For a misunderstanding about procedure, Marcus fixes him with a steady gaze. Officer Mercer, taking someone's property without legal justification isn't a procedural misunderstanding. In any other context, it would be called theft. The badge doesn't change that fundamental reality. As Lieutenant Rivera leads the stunned officers from the office, Marcus remains standing behind his desk. The weight of what has just transpired settles on his shoulders. As a reformer within the system, he's always known that meaningful change requires more than new policies on paper. It requires consistent enforcement and real consequences when those policies are violated. Today, he's demonstrated his commitment to that principle, but he harbors no illusions about how difficult the road ahead remains. Outside in the bullpen, word of the suspension spreads rapidly. Officers gather in small clusters, their conversations hushed but intense. Some defend Daly and Mercer, suggesting the punishment is excessive, driven by family loyalty rather than professional standards. Others acknowledge that their behavior crossed a line that should never be crossed, badge or no badge. Sergeant Wilson, a 20-year veteran of the force who has served under 3 different chiefs, addresses a group of younger officers who seem particularly troubled by the day's events. This isn't about taking sides, Wilson tells them firmly. This is about understanding what this badge means. He taps the shield on his chest. It means we're held to a higher standard, not given a free pass to lower ones. Chief Jenkins isn't punishing those officers for stopping his father. He's holding them accountable for dishonoring everything that badge represents. As Wilson speaks, Walter Jenkins emerges from the waiting area, where he's been composing his formal statement with the help of a department stenographer. The officers fall silent as he passes, many nodding respectfully. Walter carries himself with quiet dignity, his statement completed and signed, his pension money securely back in his pocket. He feels no triumph or vindication, only a somber satisfaction that accountability is being served. A week later, Chief Jenkins stands before the assembled press corps on the steps of the police headquarters. The investigation has moved quickly, uncovering a pattern of questionable seizures by officers Daly and Mercer. In total, 14 cases have been identified where citizens, predominantly elderly minorities or immigrants with limited English proficiency, had property seized under circumstances that failed to meet legal or departmental standards. The investigation has revealed a systematic abuse of civil asset forfeiture laws by these officers. Marcus announces, his uniform immaculate, his expression grave. As of this morning, all 14 victims have been contacted. Their property is being returned in full with interest. Additionally, the department will be implementing new oversight measures for all future seizures to ensure that such abuses cannot occur again. A reporter raises her hand. Chief Jenkins, critics are suggesting that your personal connection to one of the victims influenced the speed and thoroughness of this investigation. How do you respond to that? Marcus nods, having anticipated this question. I understand that concern, which is precisely why I recused myself from direct involvement in the investigation. Lieutenant Rivera of Internal Affairs led the review independently, following standard protocols. The only difference in this case was that one victim had the knowledge and resources to immediately report the misconduct, which allowed us to identify a pattern that might otherwise have gone undetected. Another reporter calls out, "What about the officers involved? Will they face criminal charges?" That decision rests with the district attorney's office, which has received our complete findings, Marcus replies. What I can tell you is that both officers have been terminated from the department, effective immediately. Their actions violated the trust placed in them by this community and by their fellow officers. The press conference continues, but the most significant development isn't announced publicly until the following day, when Marcus meets with the police commissioner and city leadership. Seated around a polished conference table, Marcus presents his proposal for comprehensive reform of the department's asset forfeiture practices. What happened last week highlighted systemic vulnerabilities that go beyond two rogue officers. Marcus explains, distributing detailed packets to everyone present. Civil asset forfeiture laws were originally intended to deprive criminal organizations of their resources. Over time, they've evolved into something very different in many jurisdictions, a revenue stream with insufficient oversight and inadequate protections for innocent citizens. The proposal is ambitious, requiring judicial approval before seizures can be finalized, creating an expedited appeal process for citizens, implementing body camera requirements for all interactions involving potential seizures, and establishing an independent review board to evaluate patterns of enforcement. Most controversially, it redirects all proceeds from legitimate seizures away from the police department budget and into community programs. This isn't just about preventing abuse, Marcus concludes. It's about restoring trust. When citizens believe property can be taken from them without due process, they don't see us as protectors. They see us as predators. That perception undermines everything we're trying to accomplish in community policing. The commissioner, initially skeptical about such sweeping changes, studies Marcus thoughtfully. This was inspired by what happened to your father, wasn't it? It was catalyzed by that incident, Marcus acknowledges, but it addresses problems I've observed throughout my career. My father was fortunate. He knew his rights, he had immediate access to justice, and his property was returned promptly. Most victims of asset forfeiture abuse aren't so fortunate. This reform ensures that justice doesn't depend on who you know or who you're related to. The discussion continues for hours, with various stakeholders raising concerns about implementation challenges and budget implications. But by day's end, a modified version of the proposal is approved for development into formal policy. It represents the most significant reform of asset forfeiture practices in the city's history, a lasting consequence of that afternoon encounter in Riverside Park. Later that evening, in the quiet of his office after most staff have gone home, Marcus reflects on the events that have unfolded. On his desk sits a framed photograph of his family, his wife, their two children, and his parents, Walter and Evelyn. His father's dignified face looks back at him from behind the glass, reminding him of why he chose this path in the first place. Marcus remembers the arguments they'd had when he first announced his intention to join the police academy. Walter had been vehemently opposed, fearing for his son's safety, both physically and spiritually. That system will either break you or corrupt you, Walter had warned. There's no third option. Then I'll create one, Marcus had replied with the certainty of youth. Change has to come from somewhere, Dad. Why not from me? 24 years later, Marcus touches the frame gently. His father had been both right and wrong. The system does try to break you or corrupt you, but there is a third option. You can work to transform it, one decision, one policy, one consequence at a time. It's slower than revolution, more difficult than surrender, but it's the path Marcus chose. And today, That path has led to meaningful change. The office phone rings, interrupting his thoughts. It's the front desk, informing him that the first batch of letters is ready for his signature. Formal apologies to each of the 14 citizens who had property wrongfully seized to accompany the return of their money. Marcus tells them he'll be right down. These letters won't undo the harm caused, but they represent institutional acknowledgement of wrongdoing. A small but necessary step toward healing the relationship between the department and the community it serves. As Marcus leaves his office, he passes the department's mission statement mounted on the wall: to protect and serve with integrity, respect, and accountability. Tonight, at least, those words feel a little less aspirational and a little more real. It's not justice fully realized that remains a distant goal, but it's justice in progress. And progress, his father taught him long ago, is measured not in miles but in steps. 4 Sundays after the incident in Riverside Park, Walter Jenkins eases his car into the familiar driveway of his son's suburban home. The late afternoon sunlight filters through mature oak trees, casting dappled shadows across the well-maintained lawn. This weekly family dinner is a tradition stretching back years, a sacred time when careers and responsibilities temporarily fade into the background, allowing the Jenkins family to simply be a family. Today, however, feels different. The events of the past month have shifted something fundamental in both men's lives, creating new dimensions to a relationship already rich with mutual respect. Walter carefully removes a homemade sweet potato pie from the passenger seat, Evelyn's recipe, which he's finally mastered after years of trying. His wife passed 3 years ago, but keeping her traditions alive makes these family gatherings feel complete somehow. As he navigates the brick pathway to the front door, Walter notes that his son's police cruiser is already in the driveway. Marcus typically works Sundays, often coming straight from the station to dinner. The fact that he's home early suggests he made a point of being present today. The door opens before Walter can knock. Marcus stands there in casual clothes, jeans, and a navy sweater that Evelyn had given him the Christmas before she died. The absence of his uniform makes him look younger somehow, more like the boy Walter raised than the police chief the city knows. "Right on time, Dad," Marcus says warmly, relieving his father of the pie and ushering him inside with a gentle hand on his shoulder. The gesture is small but telling. Since the incident, Marcus has been more physically demonstrative, as if reassuring himself of his father's solid presence in the world. The house fills with the comforting cacophony of family life. Marcus's wife, Aisha, emerges from the kitchen, wiping her hands on an apron, her face lighting up at the sight of her father-in-law. Behind her trail the unmistakable aromas of her famous pot roast, a recipe that, according to family lore, sealed the deal when Marcus was still trying to work up the courage to propose. Walter, perfect timing. "Dinner's just about ready," Aisha says, embracing him warmly. She's a pediatric surgeon, brilliant and warm in equal measure, with a practical efficiency that reminds Walter of Evelyn. The kids are in the living room, allegedly doing homework, but probably playing those video games. As if on cue, Walter's grandchildren appear: Zora, 16, and already showing signs of her grandmother's quiet wisdom, and Malcolm, 13, with Walter's height and Marcus's determined set of jaw. They greet their grandfather with genuine enthusiasm, Zora offering a gentle hug, while Malcolm launches into an excited description of his latest basketball game. "Grandpa, you should have seen it. Coach put me in for the final quarter, and I hit the game-winning three-pointer." Malcolm mimes the shot with perfect form, his face alight with the simple joy of athletic achievement. Walter beams with pride, ruffling the boy's short curls. "That's my grandson. I want front-row seats at your NBA debut, you hear?" The family settles into the familiar rhythm of Sunday dinner. Aisha's pot roast is accompanied by roasted vegetables, fresh rolls, and lively conversation. For a while, they carefully avoid any mention of the incident, discussing Malcolm's basketball prospects, Zora's college applications, and Aisha's challenging week at the hospital. But eventually, during a lull as Marcus serves second helpings, Malcolm breaks the unspoken moratorium. "Dad, Jason at school said Grandpa got robbed by cops, and then you fired them. Is that true?" He asks with a child's directness. A brief silence falls over the table. Marcus and Walter exchange glances, a wordless negotiation about how to address this topic with the children. "That's not exactly what happened," Marcus begins carefully. "Your grandfather experienced something unfair, and yes, I had to make some difficult decisions afterward as part of my job. But they took your money, right, Grandpa?" Zora asks, her perceptive gaze fixed on Walter. "Because you're black." Walter considers his granddaughter's question with the seriousness it deserves. These children are being raised with privileges he never had, but they still need to understand certain realities. "It's more complicated than that, Zora," Walter says finally. "Those officers made assumptions about me based partly on my race, partly on my age, partly on where I was walking. They saw an old black man with cash and jumped to conclusions that said more about them than about me." Marcus watches his father with quiet admiration. Even now, Walter maintains his lifelong commitment to nuance and fairness, never oversimplifying complex situations, even when doing so might be justified. "The important thing," Walter continues, "is that the system actually worked this time. There were consequences for wrong actions. That doesn't always happen. Because Dad's the police chief." Malcolm asks. "Partly," Walter acknowledges honestly, "but also because your father has spent his career building a department where accountability matters. The badge those officers wore represents something important, a promise to protect everyone equally. When they broke that promise, they faced consequences." Marcus clears his throat, emotion making his voice slightly rough. "The truth is, what happened to your grandfather has happened to many people who don't have a police chief in the family. One of my jobs is to make sure everyone receives the same justice your grandfather did." "Is that why you're changing the rules about taking people's stuff?" Zora asks, revealing that she's been paying closer attention to her father's work than he realized. Marcus nods, impressed. "That's exactly right. We're making it harder for officers to take property without very good reasons, and easier for people to get their property back if a mistake is made." The conversation continues through dessert, Walter's sweet potato pie receiving deserved praise, and evolves into a wider discussion about justice, reform, and the complicated relationship between law enforcement and the communities they serve. Marcus is struck by how engaged his children are, asking thoughtful questions that reveal their developing moral compasses. Later, after the dishes are cleared and the children have disappeared upstairs, Walter, Marcus, and Aisha settle in the living room with cups of coffee. The atmosphere is relaxed but thoughtful, a rare moment of adult conversation after the chaos of family dinner. "How are things at the precinct?" Walter asks, broaching the subject they've been avoiding in front of the children. "Any fallout from the changes you're implementing?" Marcus sighs, leaning back in his armchair. "Some resistance, as expected. Change never comes without friction. A few of the old guard see the new policies as an admission that we've been doing something wrong all these years." He sips his coffee thoughtfully. "And technically, they're right. We have been doing something wrong. Civil asset forfeiture has been abused nationwide. It's just that no one wanted to admit it." "And your position?" Aisha asks, always perceptive about the political dimensions of her husband's work. "Any threats there?" "The commissioner has my back, surprisingly enough," Marcus replies. "Turns out he's had concerns about forfeiture practices for years, but never had the political cover to address them. A high-profile case involving the police chief's father provided the perfect opportunity." He smiles ruefully. "Sometimes progress comes from unexpected places." Walter nods slowly, considering his son's words. "Your mother used to say that change happens when the right person is in the right place at the right time. I think she'd be proud to see you being that person." A comfortable silence settles over them, each lost in their own thoughts. Walter's gaze drifts to the mantelpiece, where a photograph of Evelyn stands amid family photos spanning generations. He can almost hear what she would say about all this. "Everything happens for a reason, Walter. even the hard things. Dad, Marcus says eventually, breaking the silence. There's something I've been meaning to ask you. Would you consider speaking at the academy graduation next month? I think the new officers could benefit from hearing your perspective, not just about what happened to you, but about your whole life experience with law enforcement, good and bad. Walter looks surprised. Me, addressing police cadets. Who better? Isha chimes in. You've seen it from both sides now. As a citizen, and as the father of a police chief. That's a valuable perspective. Walter considers the request carefully. Throughout his life, he's maintained a certain wariness around law enforcement, a necessary caution born from experiences stretching back to his youth in the 1960s. The idea of addressing a room full of soon-to-be officers would have been unthinkable just months ago. Yet here he is, contemplating exactly that. I'll do it, he decides, on one condition, that you let me speak freely. No vetting my remarks beforehand. If these young officers are going to hear from me, they should hear the unvarnished truth. Marcus nods, knowing his father well enough to understand this isn't negotiable. I wouldn't have it any other way. They need to hear the truth, especially from someone they're likely to respect. As the evening winds down, Walter remembers the other reason he came today. He reaches into his jacket pocket and pulls out an envelope. Not the same one that was taken from him, but similar. Inside is his pension money for this month, neatly organized. I'd like you to take me to the bank tomorrow, he tells Marcus. I'm thinking maybe it's time I opened one of those checking accounts you've been telling me about. Marcus raises an eyebrow, surprised by this departure from his father's lifelong habits. Really? What changed your mind? Walter considers the question, nothing dramatic. Just thinking that maybe it's time to adapt a little. Keep the money somewhere safer than my pocket. He smiles slightly. Besides, your mother always said I was too stubborn for my own good. Maybe it's time to prove her wrong for once. Progress comes in many forms, doesn't it? Marcus says, echoing their earlier conversation. It sure does, son. Walter agrees, looking at his son with quiet pride. Sometimes it's big things like changing department policies. Sometimes it's small things like an old man finally getting a bank card. But it all matters. As Marcus walks his father to the car later that evening, the two men pause in the driveway, looking up at the stars emerging in the twilight sky. Without warning, Marcus pulls his father into a tight embrace. I'm sorry it happened to you, Dad, he says quietly, the words muffled against Walter's shoulder. Walter returns the embrace, patting his son's back. I'm not, he replies with simple honesty. If it had to happen to someone, better me than someone without your number in their phone. And look at the good that's come from it already. They separate, both slightly embarrassed by the display of emotion, but grateful for it nonetheless. Walter gets into his car, rolling down the window before starting the engine. Your mother used to say everything happens for a reason, he tells his son. I didn't always believe her, but these days, I'm starting to think she was right more often than not. As Walter drives away, Marcus remains in the driveway, watching until his father's taillights disappear around the corner. Inside, his family waits. Aisha, Zora, Malcolm, the life they've built together. And tomorrow, a department of officers who look to him for leadership through complicated times. The weight of these responsibilities is substantial, but tonight it feels less like a burden and more like a privilege. The privilege of being in the right place at the right time to make a difference, however small. In his car, Walter turns on the radio, tuning it to the jazz station Evelyn always preferred. The smooth notes of John Coltrane fill the vehicle as he navigates the familiar streets toward home. He thinks about tomorrow's visit to the bank, about the academy speech he'll need to prepare, about the sweet faces of his grandchildren asking difficult questions at dinner. Most of all, he thinks about his son, the boy he raised to question authority, now wielding that authority with wisdom and restraint. You were right, Evelyn, he says aloud to the empty car, a habit he's developed in the years since her passing. Our boy did good. He did real good. The music plays on as Walter drives through the city that has been his home for over 40 years. A city that has sometimes been harsh, but has also given him a family to be proud of, and today at least, a measure of justice he never expected to see. It's not a perfect ending. Walter knows too much about life to expect those. But it's progress. And sometimes progress is enough.